to Ronnie Gruhn. We'll talk for half an hour and answer questions for half an hour. Please submit your questions for Ronnie through the Zoom Q&A feature. You may send them at any time starting right now. We won't use your names. We're recording this webinar on Monday, February 8th, and we'll put it on YouTube later. Ronnie will talk today on Europe, Trump, Brexit, and COVID, and I'll be back later to ask her your questions. Ronnie?
Hi, welcome to this new format. But as Dean mentioned, if you don't like it, you can watch it the old-fashioned way on the videos in your car or wherever. Lots going on since we talked 2 weeks ago. The overthrow of the government or the military coup in Myanmar, more stuff in China, all kinds of things, some of which I will talk about in subsequent discussions. But today I want to focus on Europe, and I want to focus on Europe for really kind of two reasons. One, because it has a lot to do with US foreign relations, and two, because Europe is inherently interesting, and three, the relationship of the United States and Europe is, of course, under reconsideration in the post-Trump era. As you will recall, Trump managed to alienate almost all heads of state in Europe. He managed to insult and threaten NATO, the security organization. He managed to badmouth the European Union. So I'm sorry for the interruption. We're having technical problems. Let me get back and say that today I want to emphasize Europe. The situation in Europe itself kept raising issues and difficulties having to do with COVID, having to do with other things, but also, of course, the alienation of the European countries under the Trump administration. And you will recall that in the past, we've talked about the fact that Biden, when he became into power, immediately said, we're back, and we want to, be allies again and savor alliances with Europe. He and his new Secretary of State got very busy very quickly, calling European leaders and trying to get the US back on track, climate change, NATO, alliances, and so forth. But of course, it's important to recognize that in the interim, while Trump was still president, Europeans also reconfigured their relationship to the United States and the world. So you will recall in last lecture, I think I mentioned that Germany and China made a trade deal before Biden came back into power. Not Biden back into power, Biden became president. And the Chinese got very busy in various relationships with European countries. Macron in France decided that the Europeans needed their own security mechanism, but they should move on that and not rely entirely on NATO. So the world didn't stand still in Europe while the US was under Trump's reign. And while Biden, quickly is trying to make amends, he, of course, has to deal with the Europe as it currently exists post-Trump on the one hand. And on the other hand, he has to deal with Europe and its activities having to do with COVID. So I want to deal with all of these issues today because they're really important in terms of the US main alliance with other democratic countries, namely European countries. So first, let me start with United Kingdom, England. You will recall that when Johnson became prime minister, he was, to put it mildly, something of a space cadet. He also said he valued his relationship with Trump, and he got off to a rather bad start in England. But he did have to negotiate Brexit, which was the exit of Great Britain from the European Union. And that was going to create problems of various kinds, both in Europe and England, which it did. The populists in England wanted quickly out. They just wanted out. Europeans tried to moderate the unhinging of the relationship. Then Johnson got around to himself trying to unhinge the worst aspects of the breach with Europe through Brexit negotiations. They didn't go particularly well. And in this context, it's worth remembering that a large chunk of the population in Great Britain who actually, I should say England, because for a variety of reasons, Scotland and to some extent Wales were fairly more on board with being part of the European Union. In England, the European Union has never really been particularly popular. That's sort of somewhat hidden in American press and newspaper releases, because the idea has always been England is different than Europe. England did not originally join the European Union. It eventually joined, but this was not just a radical right and left feeling. Fairly mainstream, we would call them progressive and liberal English people, well-educated people, not just unemployed people in England, have always questioned the relationship to Europe. Now, that changed a little bit over time with the younger generation. The younger generation being used to travel freely all over Europe. They benefited from their ability, it's called the Erasmus program, to study at various universities and easily do so in Europe. So the younger generation on the whole saw the benefits of their country being part of the European Union. But I would say from, people moving into their 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond were never particularly enthusiastic about not being, quote unquote, totally sovereign and having to listen to the regulations and being regulated by the other 26 members of the European Union. They resented conflict cases that could not be resolved nationally being taken to the European Court for adjudication. How dare the court decide on behalf of us? Think a little bit of the United States and states resenting the federal government and the federal government trying to push states to align. So there was a little bit of that. So when Brexit came along, it's true that there was a difference of opinion, but when Johnson started saying, okay, we need a better treaty relationship with Europe, we need most of our sovereignty back, but we still want the benefits of the European Union said, whoa, you can't just have all the benefits and not have a united policy on various issues. Very complicated, long story short, Brexit has now taken place. And Brexit is somewhat of a mess because while certain kind of trade relationships have been sorted out, you've probably seen photos of long lines of trucks having to wait endlessly to cross from over to Europe and vice versa. Even though the treaty that unhinged England from, or the Great Britain from Europe, tried to smoothen these things out, but there's still an enormous amount of paperwork that has to be filled out for every product, and that it aligns to the regulations that Great Britain has agreed to homogenize them with Europe and so forth. So it's been since the conclusion of Brexit, the feeling in the United States is, well, now Brexit has taken place. But actually, many aspects of Brexit haven't taken place. For example, one of the biggest British export really is the financial industry in Great Britain. And its relationship to the rest of Europe has not been sorted out yet. So there are many, T's that have to be crossed and I's that have to be dotted in order to work these things out so that Europe on the one hand agrees and on the other hand that Great Britain feels that it's not sort of hugely to their disadvantage. Johnson has been doing relatively better in recent weeks and months in handling both Brexit, but also handling his premiership. And that has less to do with Brexit and more to do with COVID. Because while England badly mishandled COVID to begin with, it is one of the better countries handling the COVID crisis because it has a good health service and it's managing to get people vaccinated, and it's orderly and people can sign up or can get to the health care. So actually, if one sort of stops the camera at this very moment, people have not as yet in Great Britain suffered from the disadvantages of their exit from Europe, and at the same time feel kind of pride to the extent of which the now more sovereign England has taken, and Great Britain has taken place, has taken its place in the COVID crisis. And if you push further even more, to more proximate times, you will see that the COVID crisis has also created a monumental mess for Europe and the EU. So let me quickly switch to the EU for a moment and show you how, in some ways, if you stop the clock this very minute, Great Britain looks better than Europe in some ways, and the European Union, which even a few months ago looked like this coherent organization, yes, it was overly bureaucratic and criticized by the English for being overly bureaucratic, but nevertheless seemed to be the functioning core or the anchor of the remaining 26 European countries. And ironically, while if you looked at it in detail over time, you could see that the European Union was in somewhat of a mess because of its negotiations with Europe, but it was also a mess because of some of the new leadership of the European Union. And that made itself manifest in the last few weeks in a very major and, in some senses, nasty fashion. So let me move to the European Union for a minute and say that the new head of the European Commission was a woman named Ursula von der Leyen. She's German, and she was supported in her position to head the very important commission by Angela Merkel because she's German and because Van der Leyen was aspiring to become replace Angela Merkel, but that didn't work out. She had troubles in her various governmental jobs, including the Ministry of Defense, at various times. And in a way, it was rewarding her in bouncing her over to head the European Commission. The other supporter of her to head the European Commission was Macron, who is, not an unnegligible figure in the EU and in Europe. And he favored her because she's fluent in French, ironically, as this may seem. She went to university in French, she's totally fluent, and he thought, okay, having at least, if it's not a French person heading the commission, at least you have a fluent French speaker, and that will help the French language being more relevant within the halls of the EU. Anyway, she got appointed, and some of her disabling characteristics in Germany began to make themselves manifest. She's not a very good head of an agency. She tends to make decisions fairly secretly and on her own. She usually has a few supporters, small circle of supporters around her. And she did something having to do with COVID, which seemed like a very wise thing, which was to say the handling of COVID in the European Union, in Europe, should be handled at the level of the European Union. It will make it a lot easier if we act as 26 and take inventory of how much vaccination we have, distribute it fairly, and so forth. And it makes a lot more sense, not every little country acting on its own, but it will manage it on behalf of the countries, dole out the vaccinations and the equipment and so forth to various countries on a fair basis, which seemed to be altogether a good idea. The problem with it was that the European Union and her office and the other offices of the European Union were totally ill-equipped to handle it. So it got to be a big mess, as in the US, right? Where what does the federal government do? The states do. There was no coordination. Various states were not getting the vaccinations they were promised. They started rebelling. They started saying, okay, Germany should go on its own, or France should go on its own. Never mind the Commission. The Commission is slow moving. It's inefficient and so forth. So the one courageous seeming act to say, okay, we the European Union can act on behalf of our members and make a mark about how efficient and how important the European Union is, even after Brexit and after Great Britain has left. That one thing fell apart and made the European Union look inefficient and ineffective, which also helped Johnson and Great Britain, because he could say, see, we didn't want to be part of this because they are making a mess of things. They're too bureaucratic. They don't really know what we're doing. So it helped. That also helped his image. So then you had the next wrinkle, and the next wrinkle, as you all saw in the press, was AstraZeneca was not being able to produce enough vaccines for distribution, and the various agreements of the European Union to get X amount, or the EU to get X amount to then distribute, were not going to be able to get distributed, and it became a muddle. What was England getting from this company, which is Oxford-based by and large, and what were the European Union countries going to get? And so she had a sort of she didn't have a fit, I presume. She stayed calm, but she sort of had a fit about all of this and said, right, we are then going to ban any movement of any vaccines from the European Union into Great Britain, okay? And once she had done that, once the Commission had done that, it was obviously good fodder for England to say, see, we told you these guys are no good. But it also did something else, which she or somebody forgot, which was that Ireland, the country of Ireland, is part of the European Union. So they, of course, would get whatever distribution of vaccines were available within the European Union. And since part of the Brexit agreement was to allow free movement between Ireland and Northern Ireland, this theoretically could mean you could get vaccines into Ireland, and from Ireland you could send the vaccines to Northern Ireland, and Northern Ireland could just send them to Great Britain, right? You forgot that there was this sort of porous thing that was created. It was created for very good reason, so as not to create a barrier between the north and the south of Ireland, but it would have allowed for an avenue to do that. And once the European Union, or Ursula von der Leyen, recognized that, they pulled a clause in the Brexit agreement which said, okay, this is not allowed. We are going to relock the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. This is an emergency. And as soon as she did that, without consultation with other members of the EU, everybody had a shit fit. And then she did what seems to be her bureaucratic style. She said, no, it wasn't me, it were my underlings. That is to say, she threw her underlings under the bus. So now you have three things. You have a more sovereign Great Britain. You have the European Union having mucked up its vaccine and COVID distribution. You have the head of the European Commission having delegitimized herself and weakened herself by her hasty and unthought out actions and her overreactions about creating, it's Article 16, you don't need to know that, but invoking Article 16, which allowed the border between North and South Ireland to be closed. And so now you have a situation where COVID, of all things, has strengthened England and weakened the European Union, which is a very surprising outcome considering where we were a few weeks ago with certainly a few months ago, with an obviously weakened Great Britain and a strengthened Europe, which said, okay, we're going to all act together. Now, there are many other wrinkles in this story, and I don't want to keep boring you with the details of it. Suffice it to say that the agreement that vaccines would not flow out of Europe, even though she's taken back the South Ireland border crossing, and we would do it all together. There are people like the authoritarian leader of Hungary, Orban, who says, never mind the European Union, we're going to get our vaccines from China or somewhere else. So it also shows that there are cracks which have existed for some time in, sorry about this telephone. Here, Dale, please take the telephone and close the kitchen door. Sorry about that. That's what happens when in your own house. So that's, and I'm in the dining room rather than my study, because people think this is a better location and better light. Anyway, sorry about that. So it has strengthened England. It has weakened the European Union. It has undermined the European Union and the Commission. It has led other European countries somewhat unraveled, okay? And that is very important to notice because it would fundamentally change many things in its relations with the world. And if I might jump back to the China situation for a moment, it has allowed countries, as I said, as Germany, but also other countries who trade very heavily with China, to say, well, we're going to look out for ourselves and not listen to the United States and other countries about their arguments with China. The German automobile industry is dependent on trade with China. Many industries in Europe are interdependent with trade with China, and they're going to be pretty careful not to listen to alarms coming from either the United States or the European Union, because they're going to be looking out for their own interests. Enter Biden and his European policy. His European policy was in some senses to strengthen interdependency in Europe, to strengthen the European Union, right? But also to strengthen America's relationship on a one-to-one basis with European countries so that they can be helpful in policies which absolutely will require the United States to align itself with other democratic countries, right? So if we're going to do anything about China, climate change, any one of these issues that we've discussed in the past, I will discuss in the future, Biden would very much like it if, on the one hand, he can restore, which he mostly probably already has or will, his one-to-one bilateral relationship with European countries, but on the other hand, that he, I think, would benefit from the European Union also playing a strong role, because the 26 remaining countries together have more leverage on international policy if all the countries are aligned. Now, what kind of policies do European countries need to be aligned on? Well, human rights, well, China, well, the Middle East, well, the coup in Myanmar, which I'll talk about subsequently, by the part of the military. It would be a lot better if Europe would speak with one voice, and one voice with including the United States, because that would have some leverage. Go country by country, they can make deals, but it doesn't allow for there to be the sort of changes that the Biden administration would welcome and would want. So the fact that Europe is in some state of disarray right now is not a good thing, either for Europe or for the Biden administration trying to change policy. And let me just give, and on the other hand, it has put UK back, England, Great Britain back into more of a driver's seat. First, because Johnson has decided, never mind that I used to be a fan of Trump, I've dropped him, and now I'm going to be on good terms with the Biden administration, and that is in the interest both of England and the United States. But it's also England being willing to be a player and align itself with the United States and the European Union in some foreign policy issue areas is also extremely important. Let me end by just saying one thing that I stressed last time in the China talk, where I said that I myself was quite unhappy about both Pompeo in his last week in office and Blinken, the new Secretary of State under Biden, both saying that what was happening with the Uyghurs and the labor camps in which people, maybe almost 2 million people are locked up, was genocide. And I was saying, well, genocide actually should be reserved to physically wiping out people and not labor camps. And I talked about the genocide treaty and so forth. Other people seem to have noticed this, and maybe the Europeans and maybe the English, I don't know. But in the last few days, there has been a change of vocabulary. We're now referring to not genocide in China, but we're referring to cultural genocide. And that is actually a very important change, because it is identifying wiping out ethnic groups of one kind or another, which also goes back to the Rohingya in Burma, Myanmar, which I'll talk about down the road again. So making this switch to now referring to it as cultural genocide, I think is very important, and a very important step back from simply calling it genocide, because one wants to have the traditional or historical view of genocide, of killing people, of people who were actually wiped out. So, for example, the Myanmar killed tens of thousands of Rohingya, right? That's genocide. And arguably, the Yemen situation, which I'll also talk about, which has new developments in the Biden administration, arguably you could say that the military activity against the Hutus Houthis has been genocidal in kind. So separating cultural genocide from just calling it genocide, I think, was a step in the right direction. So I've run over for a minute. Let me stop and see what people's questions are. I'm sorry I was rambling a bit today, trying to cover a lot.
We do have a couple of questions. Let me remind everybody that you can pose questions to Ronnie through the Q&A feature. Feel free to write in and I'll read them to Ronnie. First question is, there were plans pre-Biden for the US to get involved in the UK health service. Is that going ahead?
I don't think it's going ahead at the moment. I think people in the United States are much too busy coping with COVID in the United States at the moment and sorting out the vaccines and which vaccines are useful for what and where they should go and the shortages. So to the best of my knowledge, that is not going ahead at the moment. But on the other hand, the CDC in the United States is building up again, and presumably in the months to come will become a viable international agency again. And that's really important because that then means that we can learn something the from the health service in England and other countries. So that is one thing. The other related thing is that there is an organization called COVAX, which is an international institution which is meant to manage vaccines, especially for third world countries, underdeveloped countries, which is going to be increasingly important in Africa, for example, and Latin America. And there, the Biden administration has joined the UK and other countries in saying they're fully aboard. So the fact that we've rejoined WHO, World Health Organization, and are putting shoulder to the wheel and financial help, no doubt, to COVAX is a step closer in saying we want to align ourselves both with international health institutions that can deal with a pandemic, and then I would imagine somewhere down the line in the next few months, going back to the idea of, to what extent can some kind of alliances be made with the English health service.
The next question, I think actually, I doubt that the author intended it, but it seems to me follows up on that. Is all of the EU using the AstraZeneca vaccine? And if so, how will the current problems with that vaccine in South Africa affect the EU?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. No, Europeans are also using Pfizer and Moderna. And in fact, a big Pfizer factory, I think it's Pfizer, is located in Belgium, for example. So no, AstraZeneca hasn't even come into play until recently. So no, they were using these other vaccines. Then to what extent eventually AstraZeneca will play a bigger and bigger role as it has more supplies is unclear. And of course, the question has been raised, how effective is it for people over 65? And that hasn't been fully fleshed out, so there's more information that's needed there. There's no reason to believe it's not effective for people over 65, but it's unknown whether it is, for sure. And then the African situation is very complicated because that South African variant, it is not clear that the AstraZeneca can address it. And it is also not clear that to what extent amendments need to be made to Pfizer and Moderna to accommodate that particular version of the virus. So there are very many things that are unclear about it, not least of which, and as I said, I intend to talk about Africa maybe in the next one or the one after that meeting, is that many African countries, of course, have no vaccines whatsoever. And the question has become for poor countries of Zimbabwe, Malawi, various West African countries, the question has become, will the Europeans and the United States part with enough of their allotments of the vaccines to allow the healthcare workers, the doctors in those countries, to get vaccinated because they're dying like flies? Right? So people are being brought into the very limited and provided provisioned hospitals in various African countries. They have very few doctors there, and those doctors themselves are getting sick, and some of them are dying. And I think it was Malawi, it might have been in the paper on TV somewhere, that the doctors in Malawi are saying if somebody would give us 40,000 vaccinations, we could vaccinate all the doctors and some of the nursing staffs in our country, and then we might be in a position to actually vaccinate people. If we all die, we won't even be able to vaccinate anybody. So those questions need to be addressed by COVAX and WHO, but it also means that the United States and the EU and England need to say to themselves, we need to make some provisions for these countries as well. And it's totally unclear to what extent Pfizer and Moderna can make those provisions. But I hasten to add, there is a Russian vaccine and a Chinese vaccine. And those countries are jumping into the breach. They're saying, hey guys, we have vaccines. They actually work pretty well. You in the West have badmouthed those, but for no particular reason. You don't know what you're talking about. And we're going to ship those countries. So the COVID is now creating vaccine diplomacy, if you will, between Russia and China, saying they would make things available, and the West, which is, trying to cope with its own situation. By West, I mean both Europe and the United States, Canada, and so forth. So it's a big mess. And I would say that as soon as the leadership in the United States, in the CDC and the other agencies, get back up to speed and have good directors, I think they need to spend, maybe 20% of their time addressing these international issues. Because at the end of the day, this virus travels. And it travels, through obviously airlines and travel, but all through refugees, etc. And we're all in this together. And we're badly in need of international policy and international distribution on these vaccines, as well as more testing. So there's much work to be ahead. And in many ways, more things are unknown than there are known about all of this, actually, in terms of which vaccine will be effective. For example, let's say the Russians and the Chinese massively send vaccinations to South Africa right now. Will they be effective against the South African virus? We don't really know.
Another follow-up vaccine question. Is there any movement to open the vaccine formulas to any capable manufacturer, similar to how flu vaccines are handled?
Well, I think there will be. That is to say that the sort of vaccine nationalism that's been carried on to some extent and got quite nasty, I think will be reformed in the months to come. And if that's the case, I think that, licenses will be given to other vaccine manufacturers and so forth. It might take some months, which is why a lot of people in the COVID business say, who don't want us to be too optimistic, that things might not get better until 2024.
Okay. One participant writes, are you going to address the Burma situation today? Even a brief response would be welcome.
I couldn't understand your second word.
Okay. Are you going to address the Burma situation today? Even a brief response would be welcome.
Okay. All right. So, Burma, I have actually been to Burma, believe it or not. Not many people have been. Well, the lady, as she's called, was, in my humble opinion, politically unfit. She was much admired. She was politically unfit. She did not develop her political standing in the country. She was sort of like Ursula von der Leyen. She had a small coterie of people around her. She's politically not particularly experienced. She was this much admired figure. She won the Nobel Peace Prize and all the rest of it. Nevertheless, the population of Burma is sick and tired of the military, and they were happy to oust them, and they were happy to elect her party. And so at that particular point, the military decided, we'll have a coup and get rid of these people. Now, what's unique about this is not that countries don't have military coups, but I don't know, unique is probably an exaggeration. They're sort of using Trump vocabulary, false elections, cheating, all the rest of it. There's no evidence of that, but that's become fashionable. You don't like the election results, you say they were phony, So here we are with the military. She is under house arrest, as is her party. And what to do about any of it? Well, international pressure. can be brought to bear here. And who has the most leverage on Myanmar? It's not the United States, or for that matter, Europe, it's China, actually. And China has a difficult relationship with Myanmar because they're the main investors there and the main trading partners and the main loan givers to the government of Myanmar. On the other hand, they don't completely want to alienate the military because they want to continue their economic relationship. They're building infrastructure there. They're doing all kinds of things there. So actually, China is in a pickle about what to do about all of this at the moment. They don't necessarily want to support the military regime. On the other hand, they don't want to necessarily condemn them and help the honestly elected government to come into power because the military is very powerful. And into this mix comes the Myanmar population, which has been fairly quiet and silent over the years, but which is now out in the streets demonstrating. So you now have a kind of yellow roost situation where demonstration, or for that matter, Russian situation, where people, especially young people, are out in the street demonstrating against the military regime. How this is all going to unravel is unclear, and it's very complicated. But neither the European Union nor the United States is in a very good position other than condemn a military coup, because it doesn't have a lot of influence inside the country. And we're also, we meaning the West, in a kind of difficult situation to support the lady, as she's called, because she lost her luster, as the New York Times keeps saying, when she supported the military and its genocidal activity against the Rohingya. 500,000 or more are Rohingya refugees next door in Bangladesh, but the military mowed down the Rohingya in their villages. They were killed by the tens of thousands. And she went to the international court and defended the military government, saying, no, this wasn't genocide. This was, exaggerated and so forth. So she no longer has any leverage on Western sympathy as being the person standing in favor of human rights and being able to spearhead a movement in favor of human rights. So the West is in a pickle because they can't rightly support her anymore very easily. They do want to support the outcome of the election, but who else can they be supporting other than her in her particular party? It's not obvious. The young people are in the street, and the military are just arresting people right and left. They've cut down the internet, etc. So it's a very fluid situation, but it's a very messy situation, and for a variety of reasons, historically because of her, but also because it's a massive military coup, it's gotten a lot of attention. And I'm not sure exactly what the US is going to do in terms of its policy. But as I said, one thing to watch is the Chinese policy, because I wouldn't like to be Xi right now trying to figure out what to do under this situation.
To return to vaccine questions, here's another one. How much power do the corporations who make vaccines have in deciding what countries get the vaccine? Can they sell to anyone, to the highest bidder?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Up to now, not really, because the governments paid these pharmaceuticals to develop the vaccines and are buying them from them, right? So even though we seem to be getting them free, this has not been free. Those pharmaceuticals have made a ton of money getting the funding to do the research, and to some extent providing them at either no cost or at curtailed cost. So governments have had some control over these. Of course, AstraZeneca is not entirely English and so forth. So as more companies come into play and as more vaccines become available, the companies will no longer be under contract with governments to supply a certain amount, in which case it will be bargaining, I believe, I'm just hypothesizing, that will start taking place where some governments will bid and say, we'll pay you more if you give them to us. So I imagine there's going to be a fair amount of bargaining and even sort of fairly sleazy activity that's going to happen down the road. But at the moment, they were, up until now, they've been fairly locked in. Because,
so where will that leave countries that can't afford to buy the vaccine on their own?
It will lead them to depend on COVAX and the World Health Organization to provide the funding to purchase those so that they can have access to them.
And where will those organizations get that funding?
From donations from member countries, for example, the United States. So it goes in a circle.
I thought that's where you were headed.
It goes in a circle, and it's pretty complicated, and it's, it eventually will not be easy to control, especially because you will have Chinese and Russian and then other manufacturers in the mix, right? And so they will be various kinds of bidding. And I'm not going to be surprised and shocked when the United States and European countries begin to say, you're better off getting it from our companies because we're careful and we monitor the quality of these vaccines and so forth, rather than sort of purchasing them from unreliable countries like Russia, right? And so there will be that kind of propaganda going on. How unreliable Russia is going to be or China is going to be is completely unclear, because so far there is no evidence. And those countries, by the way, have very good scientists and very good labs, whatever else one thinks of them. So there's no particular reason to believe that their manufacturers can produce good and safe and appropriate vaccines. The problem for Western countries is that they haven't shared the scientific evidence to show safety and safety for what populations and so forth. So once that becomes more public, African countries just say, well, the hell with Pfizer and Moderna and all those countries. We're getting ours from China or Russia, and this will work fine. And I'm sure that China, at least, will make these vaccines available to countries without, huge costs. So it's going to be a very messy situation if you're asking me for my opinion, but it's just an opinion.
Well, we still have some time for a couple more questions if people want to write them in. But in the meantime, let me ask this one. Does that leave room for corruption?
Is there what?
Is there room for corruption in the vaccine, in the sale and transfer of vaccines?
Yes, you don't have to look very far. You just have to look at the U.S. There is an island, its name I cannot recall, off of Florida, which you can only reach by boat and I guess helicopter or whatever. There's no road leading to it, in which the houses are owned by very affluent people, extremely affluent people, millionaire type affluent people. And wouldn't you know it, they've all been vaccinated, irrespective of age or anything else, right? Mm-hmm. And then, yes, so that sort of thing can happen. It's, who in government can get vaccinated, who in the bureaucracy, can figure out ways to get vaccinated. And even in the US, there's sort of backdoor ways. Look at our local situation. You have to be the right age and everything else. And then you run into somebody who is 45 years old who got vaccinated. How did they get vaccinated? They were volunteers at the vaccination centers who, at the end of the day, the vaccination centers have vaccines left over. and they then give them to the volunteers who are working at the vaccination centers. So I'm not saying that that is corruption. What I'm saying is it's easy to imagine corruption when you run into people that seem to have vaccinated who are not in the right categories. And at the same time, yes, there's corruption. And I assure you that if vaccines start arriving in various African countries, there's going to be a lot of corruption unless Doctors Without Borders and others are supervising the vaccinations and make sure that it's not that everybody who has a brother or uncle in the government gets vaccinated first.
Okay, we're down to pretty close to the end. There was one comment that came in that about the relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain. ZOE, a group formed by Oxford, Harvard, and Stanford, is holding transatlantic research, doing transatlantic research to coordinate people's reactions to the virus. It's a daily check-in and has a weekly transatlantic Zoom to discuss issues on both sides with the medical research teams. There was no question there, but there was some information.
Yes, and that sort of liaisons is going on not just with these institutions that were mentioned, but is also going on across borders in Europe in various ways. And even, believe it or not, Russian scientists in their labs are coordinating with some of the scientists in Europe and so forth. I mean, the scientists are globalized nowadays. I think that's a really important. We talk about globalization and how it's working or not working. One of the ways it's working is that people in various fields of science very often coordinate nowadays. They're in touch with each other. They're teams, not just on COVID, but in other areas of medicine and science. People are working in transnational teams and communicating and Zooming now. And I think it's by us, sort of regular citizens living in Santa Cruz, it's hard to believe to what extent these networks, these globalizations have become very customary and consultative. And that's a really good thing. And why it is that in those communities, people are very unhappy when barriers are put up between governments and amongst governments. And when, for example, scientists in a country that are cooperating with other scientists all of a sudden lose their internet because their authoritarian government shuts it down and so forth. So yes, that's a very important point to be making. Thank you for that point.
And with the shutdown of the internet, you also prevent the dramatic increase in pre-publication of scientific research, which has just exploded in recent years.
Yes, and it's exploded, and there's a lot of really, really good work, and then there's a fair amount of garbage, and it needs to be vetted. So, scientific journals get garbage as well as really good research, and they vet it. They have, people go over it very, very carefully. But whether you're talking about COVID or CRISPR or any of these things, the amount of international cooperation and activity, which is if I might just editorialize on this since we have a minute, one of the most idiotic things that countries can do is make it either impossible or difficult for people to study in other countries. The number of scientists in China, in other countries that have studied in the United States are really important, not just because they've benefited from witnessing our democracy, which is how it's often put in newspapers, but because they've made linkages that are often linkages for life with other scientists and so forth. The degree, making it difficult for foreign students to come to the United States is one of the most idiotic things that the Trump administration has done. And besides, curtailing future globalized activity, it also has the impact that it's going to shut down a whole bunch of American colleges and universities who are completely dependent financially on foreign students. Even here at UCSC, the financial support that poor students get from UCSC is essentially garnered from the foreign students who pay a lot of money. If you keep them out, that money erodes. And many small colleges in the US are going to have to close if we don't allow more foreign students to come back. The same thing is true in England. One of the most idiotic things that England did or the UK did was to curtail foreign students studying there. And so I am a big proponent, it may be a prejudice, of saying that the more open borders there are for scientists, but also for people to study science and other subjects, economics and other things, across national borders, the easier it is to operate in a crisis like the COVID crisis and others. And also, the easier it is for research to benefit from different ideas coming from different scientific establishments and so forth. Not to mention that the politics benefits, because if people have linkages, it's easier to understand what other societies are about.
One comment and one question as we get ready to close. A comment from one of the participants recommending a local website in San Miguel de Allende for reliable COVID information done by local doctors for expats in both English and in Spanish. And then the closing question, the conventional wisdom is that Brexit will lead to the long-term decline of Great Britain. Does this still appear to be true?
Yes, but a weak yes. It is obviously, as everybody predicted, going to do economic harm to Britain, to England. Let's just take England for a moment. The economy is, of course, in disarray in most countries because of COVID. So it's hard to know at this point how much is COVID, how much is other things. But most economists think that the British economy will decline by up to maybe 4%, which is not good. But particular industries or particular lines of work, for example, the financial industry, which I referenced earlier, if it is too difficult for the European countries to deal with the financial industry in England now that there are borders, they will increasingly try to move their financial components to Europe. And one of the big industries in England will have a lot of harm, a lot of unemployment done to it. For example, some of the financial industries in Great Britain have already been located to Frankfurt, Germany, even before Brexit was fully signed and delivered. So harm will be done to the economy, harm will be done to the economy of particular industries. And then the question is, how much harm will be done in places like Scotland and Wales? And to what extent will that continue a desire for independence from Great Britain? May not happen. If it happens, it's not going to happen fast. They can't even have a referendum in Scotland without the approval of the British Parliament, for example. But it is the case that if England becomes little England and its larger Great Britain will go its own way and will become more autonomous and eventually want independence, then of course it will diminish the role of England, of Great Britain, or it will diminish the role of England, and it'll become just, little England to some extent. So some people who are against Brexit fear this. Exactly how this is going to unravel is a little hard to say, but it's for sure going to be a problem. And how much of a problem is still unclear. And as I said, I'm repeating myself, part of the lack of clarity has to do with, even though there are warning signs at this point, it's hard to know how much is COVID and the decline of economies everywhere under the auspices of COVID versus the Brexit on its own.
Okay, thanks, Ronnie. We hope that everybody enjoyed today's webinar with Ronnie. Join us again in 2 weeks on Monday, February 22nd at 11 a.m. for another in the series of commentaries on international affairs with Ronnie Gruhn. Thanks.